Crazy fangled fact finder, I'm going to be fact finding through the process, and so I want you to recognize that where I'm doing the fact finding may be different than where you do it or how you do it, but the fact finding is taking place nevertheless, and it's built into the process. So they've just said, I've just asked, so does it make more sense when we're dealing with your financial house to work with the chop shop or the risk management firm, the financial physician? And what have they said? Probably? Probably the physician, right? Probably that serves my best interest. Okay, good. So now we're going to test that. And it may be just a touch uncomfortable, and I'll let them know that, but it's okay. We're going to ask some of the questions that are critical in making sure that we adequately diagnose before we prescribe. That's the philosophy. That's what we're trying to understand. That's what we're accomplishing. That's where we're headed. And they go, okay, great. And the conversation then becomes, would you not agree? And I'll ask this question to you. Wouldn't you agree that we as human beings have the ability to create virtually unlimited amounts of liability for ourselves? Examples? Everybody's got the dog that doesn't bite till it does. Right? Everybody's got some other circumstance, whether it's they like to golf, and most of us haven't been accused of wrongful death after hitting somebody in the back of the head with a golf ball, but it could happen. What are some of the other ways we can create personal liability for ourselves? Vehicle. Absolutely. We go out and pile up how many cars on the freeway? What's the average cost per vehicle?
25 to 35.
Yeah. So here's the question. Would you agree that we can run out there and we can really accumulate in very short order infinite amounts of liability? There's only one big problem. I've yet to see a Horace Mann policy or anybody else's industry-wide that has one of those symbols on the deck sheets. Have you? Limited limits of liability, unlimited. Liability, underlying limits, there are no limits. You give us a finite premium, we'll cover an infinite amount of your stupidity. You ever read a deck sheet that says that? Okay? Of course not. Why? We define them as limits of liability to see if we can't limit the exposure that a company has so they can stay in business, so they can be around to pay claims for more people than that one unlimited exposure, right? So what do your deck sheets say when you get them? A whole variety of things, right? And when you're looking at those limits in comparison to what they currently have, if you happen, it's okay to admit, I sometimes, you'll say, function in the chop shop side of the T-chart, and I'm looking at liability limits and wondering if I can beat it from a price perspective and stuff and stuff and stuff. It's okay. We're big boys and girls, we can admit that. But as you're looking at those limits, I guess I'm going to ask you the question, how in the world do you know how to prescribe proper limits?
It's all subjective, I guess.
Is it?
Well, you might have a half a dozen guys go in and do the same interview, and you'll have a half a dozen different results.
But this is interesting. Let's explore this a little bit. How do you typically come up with the limits of liability that you recommend?
Looking at the assets you're protecting.
Looking at the assets you're protecting. But I know all of you are taking the time, every time you're having a conversation, to actually, this is called fact finding, right? To actually inventory the assets. Are you actually doing that?
It's in the purse folder.
It is. It's in the purse folder. But let me ask the question. I know you're filling that out completely every time you sit down with somebody.
Absolutely perfect.
Ah, that's right. Okay? So the question's this. What types of assets do people have? And if I could get you thinking, here's one of the great big, maybe you guys will all come to this conclusion, and I'm the dumb kid in the class. That's probably the case, but guess what one of the big lights in the world was that came on for me at some point 10 years ago or so? I remember this day. I was sitting back at the American College. I was trying to finish a master's degree at the time. And as I sat back at the American College in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, I sat there and all of a sudden the light went on. And I went, oh my goodness, property and casualty has very little to do with homes and autos. Those happen to be the things that we quote insure, and they happen to be the forms and policies on which this liability coverage goes. But do you know what? I came to the realization that property and casualty was actually primarily not about homes and autos, but primarily about what?
Person.
Asset protection, vis-a-vis the liability limits. And if the underlying limits weren't sufficient to cover the level of assets I was dealing with, then I was supposed to be thinking through umbrella policies, extended liability out to $1 million or $2 or $3 million, right? So how do we inventory assets?
Back when I was a younger agent, I was sitting at a wealthy man's kitchen table, and he was considering an umbrella policy. And I told him we had a $500, $1 million, and a $2 million plan, and he couldn't decide on whether he wanted, which one he wanted. I said, well, sir, without taking a look at your financial history and doing a fact finder, I can't tell you exactly how much you need, but I do know one thing. If you have more assets than you have insurance, then you need more insurance. He said, I'll take the $2 million.
And what did he tell you?
He said, I'll take the $2 million.
Understood, but what did that tell you?
That he needed more insurance and he had more assets than
Yeah, he didn't tell you just the amount of insurance he needed, it told you the amount of assets he had.
Sure.
Now the question was, in the fact-finding process, and here I go with the T-chart, you knew I would, okay? The question's this. When we delineate assets, there are two types. Pardon me. Now I'm going to get in the way of you and your food. This is going to be happy. So here's the question. We've got non-qualified assets and we've got qualified assets. Right? Which type of assets are typically exposed to the claims of creditors if you exceed your liability limits by getting in a wreck and not having the coverage you need?
Non-qualified.
The non-qualified. The retirement assets are typically Pension Protection Act of 2006 protects IRA assets up to the first $1 million, right? Most qualified assets, particularly those governed by ERISA, are sheltered from the claims of creditors. But if I'm in the mode of gathering assets in my conversation, let me just conveniently note, I'd like to understand them all, not just those that can be protected with sufficient liability limits. Make sense? So what are some examples of non-qualified assets?
CD.
CD, savings account, cash, keep going,
Gold, silver.
precious metals,
Property.
property. Then you got everything else over here in the 403B, the 401k, the IRA, etc., right? And I can walk through a fact-finding process that helps me understand what level of assets I'm either dealing with or not dealing with. Because if I'm with that young educator, what do I typically find on both sides of the chart? Not too much yet.
Not too much.
Right? Now, let me make the pitch, if I can, for reasonably high liability limits on that brand new educator who doesn't have a whole bunch of assets that would justify these higher limits. Why might I advocate in behalf of higher limits for the young educator?
It's mild.
Ability to earn.
Not sure about that.
Ability to earn, because wages could be garnished in the worst case scenario, right? What else do I understand about the young educator? They might be interested in avoiding bankruptcy court. You know any young or old educators that would have that interest? What happens if you go out and pile up a bunch of automobiles and you don't have enough coverage to take care of things like property damage, and personal injury that results, what ends up happening?
They sue you?
And what happens if you don't have assets and they can't get blood from a turnip?
Take
Shoot
future
you.
wages?
They can garnish your wages, or you can file bankruptcy for some protection, right? So the thought becomes that even for those without assets, liability limits may make, substantial liability limits can make sense because they're not that much more, right? So the question is, do I delineate the assets properly as I do a review of the liability limits? Now my question's this. If the answer is yes, and I typically understand what they're holding here, can you see why I liken this to the rubber glove? If I'm asking questions about, let's put non-qualified assets on paper, on my yellow pad, on my T-chart, on my PERS folder, on my whatever, and then I start asking, now let's talk about qualified assets. Guess what people are going to do on a regular basis?
Review their
What do you
assets.
do? What do you do when the rubber glove comes out?
Grimace?
You grimace. You resist. Truly, as a human being, you resist that process. We'll leave it at that with chips and salsa. But here's the point I'm driving at. The resistance is actually your huge opportunity to differentiate yourself. I recognize that this isn't a comfortable conversation. I recognize you haven't known me long enough to probably feel comfortable laying all this out on the table. I get it. But until we go here, until we undergo the examination, what do I know?
Very little.
Very little, and certainly not enough to help you understand whether I can help you or not. Until we diagnose, you certainly won't hear me prescribe. You put it in those terms, and what do? Okay, I've got this much in my savings account, I've got this much here, I've got this much there, and I want you to know that what we discuss is absolutely confidential. Right? I might reassure them. But do you hear me talking about the hard charge forward to simply properly diagnose the situation? How in the world, I mean, that guy you just mentioned knew that he needed $2 million of umbrella coverage because he had about X amount in assets and didn't want those assets out there hanging in the wind every time he didn't want those assets in the trunk with him every time he pulled out of his driveway to go somewhere, right? And therefore, proper liability limits can make sense. Now, here is a great, big, huge red flag moment. And it is not just a red flag moment if there aren't assets. So let's assume that I've had this conversation and I'm with that young educator, and that young educator says, hey, I've got about, $800 in my savings account, and I really have not accumulated for retirement or build any assets on that other side, and I really don't have much at this point. Oh, I'm just so embarrassed. I probably should have done more. Boy, what a great opportunity to, hey, you know what? Maybe we ought to think about compensating our educators better so you've got more to work with. That's a popular statement, right? And then, in addition to, hey, I think you've probably done about as well as you've known how in the first 2 years and 3 years and 4 and 5 years you've taught, but yeah, there are some things we ought to work on here. Now, if you don't see the assets on the T-chart or on your fact finder, on your yellow pad, however you do it, what should be going off like bells and whistles in your mind, particularly if they happen to have a spouse, if they happen to have a young child? Lack of assets, and I know this is a little counterintuitive. I'm trying to help you understand. I guess where I'm headed with this is I'm asking you to make some connections in your mind that you might not have made previously with financial services directly off the property casualty ledger. Why did we delineate assets on this site? Because I was in the middle of protecting assets, hopefully, by prescribing proper liability limits, right? But this is inextricably linked to some other things. Not just their asset accumulation, but what? Their habits. You're getting to know them. What else might this young educator with a spouse and potentially a first child need?
The educator is the asset.
You guys, here it is. Say again.
The educator is the asset.
The educator is the asset. Guess what? You're right. If something happens to the educator prematurely or otherwise, that's going to spell world of hurt for family, and they need some life insurance. We're the professionals around the table, and maybe I didn't ask that question particularly well, but we did not. It took some real thought here to drag this idea of life insurance out of your minds. Why?